Good morning, afternoon or evening, and welcome back to Marginal Gains. Now, for many a new 0 AD player, especially those with a background in Age of Empires, the rush to build defensive fortifications such as towers and walls can see them lose a lot of games. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, but fundamentally it's just because it's a different game. So, if you want to join me now, let's have a look at your defensive options and see if there's any advice on how to use the best available fortifications to your advantage. One of the first things that many Age of Empires players try to do when they're first taking up 0 AD is protect themselves with walls. Now, I know that quick walls in AoE are a legitimate approach, but in 0 AD they're actually very rarely used at the top level. That said, there are other defensive fortifications that are used all the time, so we're going to have a lowdown of these and then have a look at how they might be used. Let's start at the start, as you may expect, with Phase 1, the Village Phase. So Phase 1. And the village phase, that is, to give it its proper title, will give you 3 options to defend yourself, and if you're bold, also to harass enemies with structures as well. So first up, we'll look defensively at sentry towers and wooden palisade walls. So looking at palisade walls first, the most important thing to say is that they're not actually all that useful in Phase 1. It's too difficult to obtain the wood required to wall yourself in like people do in AoE, and if you do have that spare wood, then you're better off just putting it into making soldiers if you want to defend yourself. However, the sentry towers, on the other hand, can be pretty useful. They cost only 100 wood, and so if you see your opponent training cavalry, then one of these covering your main wood line is a decent move to defend against rushes. The only difficulty you can have with them is that they're actually relatively easy to capture if your opponent comes at you with lots of infantry. But if your opponent's stocking up on cavalry for their raids, then a handful of spearmen coupled with a tower is probably actually sufficient to defend you. The other structure available to you in the village phase is the outpost. Now, the interesting thing about these is they can be built outside of your territory and give you additional range in your line of sight. Now, a few of these are really useful to allow you to see where attacks will be coming from, and they're especially helpful in giving advance warning against rushes. An additional option, though, is if you want to be a bit more aggressive, then an audacious tactic is to build outposts around your opponent's territory. This utilises the fact they can be built in neutral areas of the map. And not only does it give an idea as to what your opponent is up to very close to their civic centre, but they also fire arrows. Now, this means that female citizens of your opponent collecting wood are going to be hit and they'll run off. There's also no real chance to hit back without committing a reasonable number of soldiers to capture the tower, which leads to phenomenal amounts of idle time for your enemy. So that's an interesting idea, I'm sure you'll agree. Moving swiftly on to the town phase, we get a few new things to add to our list of available fortifications. These are defence towers, stone walls, and the chance to build additional civic centres. Now, I understand that civic centres may be a contentious addition here, but they're included as they can be garrisoned and they fire arrows. So for me, that seems to meet the criteria of something that fortifies a position. And anyway, it's my video, so it's my rules. So as they're included, we can also probably add into the mix the military colony that the Seleucids and the Ptolemies have, as they're basically just miniature civic centres. So, having hit Phase 2, the first thing that you can do is upgrade any sentry towers you built in Phase 1 to turn them into defence towers. If you choose to do this, then you end up paying an additional 50 wood overall compared to building a defence tower from scratch, but if you already have the sentry tower, then it's well worth upgrading them to defence towers. And the reason for this is that defence towers can garrison more soldiers, normally 5, but 8 in the case of Iberians, and it increases the armour from 20 to 25, while also doubling the hit points of the tower in general. Now, stone walls are similar to palisades in that they're theoretically useful, but they're still rarely used. This is in part due to the cost, but also because they actually tend to box you in rather than keep the enemy out. However, they can be really useful a bit later on in the game, especially if you can get them on the edge of your territory to protect catapults that are firing into your opponent's base. And the final items of note are the civic centres and military colonies. Now, these have a territory root, which means that they radiate loyalty. This increases your territory and also keeps buildings nearby loyal. Now, building one of these will create an expansion in your territory, and expansion has 3 main purposes. Firstly, it gives you access to greater number of resources. It also reduces your opponent's access to those same resources. And finally, it allows you to move the front line of the battle closer to your opponent's base. You can do this by building barracks, temples, and other offensive buildings on your new front line, which squeezes your opponent and allows your army to reinforce and repair more efficiently. Now, in terms of when to expand, it's generally a good idea to do this in Phase 2 if you can, but always make sure that while doing this, it is not to the detriment of your ability to increase your population and that it doesn't delay your move to Phase 3. Fortresses are the only additional fortification that you're going to find available to all factions come the city phase, although there are some quirky individual buildings and structures available for individual factions. They're the strongest building in the game, they have double the crush damage of civic centres, and they can also be garrisoned with up to 20 citizens. They generally have 4200 hit points, but the Celtic factions are slightly lower at 3360, and the Greeks are slightly higher at 4620. And as for the Iberians, well, they just max the whole thing out at 6000 hit points. And the fortress is also pretty essential for most factions, as it's going to be the building from which you train your heroes and or your siege weapons. So where exactly to build them to greatest effect is actually a point of great contention. On the one hand, if you put them on your front line, it reduces the resupply length and also gives you a solid base that's difficult to displace. But going in from the front can be very provocative, and getting up that fortress against enemy fire can cost a lot of dead soldiers, as your opponent really isn't going to want it on his doorstep. So, if you do have sufficient stone, then building another one closer to your enemy's territory and contesting that, while building another one more discreetly a bit further back, is a good way to go, especially if the forward location is covered by other defensive fortifications. So there we have it. Hopefully you'll feel a little more confident in using fortifications in a measured and thoughtful way, one that fits in with and supports your overall strategy. As with everything in 0AD, it's not about one-size-fits-all and blanket approaches. Instead, it's important to utilise whatever weapons are in your armoury and take advantage of the map in order to defeat your opponent. So, as I'm producing videos a little less regularly at the moment due to quite a lot going on with work, remember to like, subscribe and click the bell. Also, have a great week and I'll see you again shortly. Muito obrigado e adeus.